On behalf of Concordia MSA and all the MSAs that supported this event and worked very hard to make it possible, I welcome all of you here tonight. And I would like to also let you know that this event was organized much before the action that took place in Kosovo. So we didn't want to cancel it, where I know that many of you had lots of other concern at this time. But we hope that this will also help to bring Muslims and Christians' ideas closer together as a dialogue, as an exchange of ideas, that tonight is a rare opportunity. Indeed, for all of us to listen directly to the experts in this field, be able to learn from them, obtain some of the knowledge that they worked very hard to gain, and also to be able to ask them questions directly. I like, however, to remind you with one of these metaphors that help us all understand how we can obtain the maximum benefits. To really be able to get this benefit, I expected that every one of us here tonight have left the prejudices, misinformations, and stereotypes out of this auditorium before walking in. And the metaphor that really makes it quite picturesque in front of us to understand what that means, which is most of us know about the story of this elephant with the philosopher who brought some of the people, group of people, blindfolded them and put them in front of the elephant and asked them to recognize what was there. So the first one put his hand on the elephant and said, that's a wall. And the other put his hand around the legs and said, that's a tree. And the third held his tail and said, that's a rope. And the fourth put the trunk and said, that's a hose. And none of them was able to recognize the truth. And the reason, of course, is because they were blindfolded. But this blindfold can happen to us even though we can see with our eyes. But the important is to be able to see with our hearts. The blindfold of the hearts happened because of prejudices that blind our hearts. And it is very important for us, for the maximum benefit that we can obtain from listening to this dialogue tonight, we should open our heart and listen to it without these prejudices. Otherwise, you will not be able to reach the truth. The purpose, again, is to bring those ideas closer, to be able to have dialogue and exchange among us Muslims and Christians in general. Tonight, we're lucky to have among us Dr. Pamela Bright, who is indeed very bright. And after obtaining her PhD in theology in relation to Christianity and Judaism in antiquity, she moved forward up the ladder in education to become the chair of Concordia Theology or Theological Study Department. She wrote many books. She wrote, edited, co-editor of many books, articles, and papers that was also introduced in different conferences since 1987 until today. I don't think you can find them as an expert higher than that in this area. We also have with us Brother Shabir Rowley, whom many of us know, who excelled in the area of comparative religion. He was also the president of the Islamic Information Center in Toronto, a host of a weekly radio broadcast heard in Toronto and Winnipeg. He is the author of many booklets in relation to comparative religion. He frequently represented Muslims and Islam in different dialogues and debates about some of these issues that we like to bring our opinions or our ideas closer together on it. And he is currently pursuing a Bachelor of Art degree with Laurentian University in Sudbury. I hope we will appreciate the expertise of our guest speakers tonight and extend our courtesy to both of them and listen to them attentively. We will start with Dr. Pamela Bright for half an hour. Then we will go for prayer. We'll break for prayer. That will be in 7th floor. And then we'll come back and Brother Shabir Ali will have another half an hour. Then redirect from Dr. Pamela Bright for 10 minutes and 10 minutes for Brother Shabir Ali, then 5 minutes each. Then we'll be listening to your questions.
It is not the first time that I have had the great pleasure of being invited by an Islamic student association. When I was teaching for many years in Chicago, there my own students, my own Islamic students, organized to invite me, and they chose the topic. They wanted to understand what we understood by grace in the Christian tradition. I was amazed at the choice of the topic, and I remember with great pleasure the dialogue that ensued. I also want to tell you that when I had my own students in Chicago, in the theology department there, I encouraged them to start their studies of Arabic, and I also encouraged their going on to master's and doctoral level in the study of the Quran and so on. Because I think when we deeply study our own traditions, then the best kind of dialogue can take place. And it is on that kind of playing field that I am so happy to be here tonight. We take a topic, the resurrection of Jesus. What I would like to do as a theologian is to give you some background of the Christian concept of resurrection, so that we can kind of clear the misunderstandings and get to the center of what is at the depth of this question. Now, I don't know if I can move across here. Is that fine? Good. And where do I go from here? Is that clear? And how about our... Good. The first thing, I will be looking at it in basically 3 parts and trying to watch my time. The first part will be theological considerations, the second will be historical considerations, and third, a look at the literature, just some selections from the literature. So first of all, theological considerations, because resurrection is not a philosophical idea, it's not medical, it's not something that can be, you can go up to a journalist and say, well, you know, you met Jesus the day after the resurrection, you know, and you had a conversation. No. It is a theological consideration. First of all, it has to be separated from the idea of the immortality of the soul. Resurrection is different from immortality of the soul. Plato believed in the immortality of the soul. The Stoics believed in the immortality of the soul. If you go to ancient burials in Egypt or elsewhere, They believed in the continuation of the life of the car, of the soul, whatever they call the soul. Resurrection is not that. Nor is it resuscitation. That's a medical term. You know, someone has a near-death experience and they're resuscitated. Resurrection is a theological consideration, theological concept. It's theology because it has to do with our relationship with God. Theos, logos. Theos, logos. I'm not here to speak of the mystery of God, but I can give a reasoned account of my faith in God. And that's why it's theos, logos. Theology, because it concerns an understanding, that's the logos, of God's relationship with humanity. Now, in that case, when we look at resurrection, it's a theological concept that that was articulated in what we called the Second Temple period, in between the return of the Jewish people from Babylon to the first century of the Common Era. You begin to find an elaboration of an understanding of resurrection. You don't find it in the earliest works of in the earliest writings of the Jewish people. Not at all. They had very, very vague ideas of any kind of life after death. They just spoke in very, very vague terms of Sheol and so on. But by 2 or 3 centuries before the Common Era, you know, we mean the Common Era, the first century, they began to write and talk about the theological concept of resurrection. And what did they mean by an idea of resurrection? Resurrection is something about God's attitude towards humanity. Resurrection had to do with God's fidelity. God's fidelity. The fidelity, it was a demonstration of the power of God over evil, oppression, and especially injustice. And the Jews began to speak about the day of the Lord. On the day of the Lord, all the oppressors, all the murderers, all the unjust, all those who would destroy truth, all those who were acting evilly would be revealed for what they were. Evil would be revealed for what it was. And so they spoke about the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord was the victory of God, in which the power and the goodness of God was seen, was demonstrated and seen. So you see, we're very far from talking about something like the immortality of the soul. I'm not disputing the immortality of the soul. I'm saying that resurrection had to do with the response in faith that God was the source of all good and that he rejected evil and oppression and injustice. Now, the historical considerations. As I said, the first time we start hearing about the idea of resurrection occurred after the Jews had returned from Babylon, after what we call the return from the exile, and before when the temple was rebuilt. Remember, Solomon's temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and then a second temple was much less beautiful, and yet it was the center of their worship and their life. It was a time of increasing anxiety within the people who had returned from the exile. It was a time when it was obviously a time when new nations were rising in the area. the Near East. It was a time also of increasing materialism within the nation. We're not suggesting that all injustice was outside of the people. It was very, very clear that there was injustice, oppression, materialism inside the people as well. And of course, the reaction, the rise of the prophets, the great prophets who were speaking and their words being recorded before the Babylonian exile. We have Jeremiah and Isaiah and so on. But you find a whole range of prophetic voices being raised against injustice, oppression, and evil, and the repeated calls for repentance of life. They wanted repentance. They wanted the people to trust in God, not in money or outside kings or the power of arms or anything like that. They wanted to trust in God, and they wanted a renewal of fidelity. Now we can turn to the literature so that we can give you some idea of how this theological notion of resurrection began to be elaborated and clarified. I could turn to many authors, but I would like to have a look at the prophet Joel. And in reading just a few phrases from the prophet Joel, the word of the Lord which came to Joel. And the whole of Joel is turned to the idea the day of the Lord is coming. And remember, the day of the Lord was the victory of God, in which the goodness of God is revealed and injustice is revealed for the ugliness and the evil that it is. Put on sackcloth, you priests, and mourn. Lament, you ministers of the altar. Come lie in sackcloth all night long, you ministers of my God. For grain offering and drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. Appoint a solemn fast, proclaim a day of abstinence, and so on. The day of the Lord is near, the day of the Lord. It comes as a mighty destruction from the Almighty. The destruction, of course, is the destruction of evil and the revelation of the goodness of God. Chapter 2, blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on the holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. A day of darkness and gloom is at hand, a day of cloud and of dense fog, like blackness spread over the mountains, and so on. But the day of the Lord swallows up evil, injustice, oppression. I would like to turn to another set of writings at the time, a little later. In fact, this would be the Book of Wisdom, it is called. And the Book of Wisdom was not written in Hebrew, it was written straight in Greek. And it was written in the Jewish community in the great city of Alexandria. And when you read this, a few excerpts from the Book of Wisdom, you hear something new happening. They are still talking about the day of the Lord coming, but they are not so much talking about the nation as a whole anymore. They're talking about individuals, the individual who sins, the individual who is unjust, and above all, the individual who suffers to the point of losing their life. Now, this individual, this just one, who will suffer and who will be faithful to the Lord, no matter what, this person, man or woman, and there are examples of men and women, this individual is a witness, will witness by his life and his death that all of his or her faith is in the goodness of God, and with utmost trust in the triumph of the victory of God sometime. That's faith. This person, the just one, who will show with his or her very life, is given the word in Greek, witness, and the word in Greek for witness is martyr. So we find in the wisdom material many references to a development of the theology of martyrdom. The martyr is the ultimate witness to belief and trust in the triumph of the goodness of God. Nothing can overwhelm the goodness of God. Evil cannot triumph. That's the faith of the just one, who will lay down his life if he or she is called upon. I read a few words from the book of the Wisdom of Solomon, as I said, written in Alexandria in the 1st century before the Common Era. It talks about the unjust people, first of all, shouting and explaining that they are triumphing. They mock the just one. Come, let us enjoy the good things while we can, and with all the eagerness of youth make full use of the creation. Let us have costly wines and perfumes to our heart's content. Let no flower of spring escape us. Let us crown ourselves with rosebuds before they wither. This has really passed into the language. And so it goes on. However, the Book of Wisdom says, but the just person, even one who dies an untimely death, shall be at rest. It is not length of life and number of years which bring honor to age. If people have understanding, they have grey hairs enough, and an unblemished life is the true ripeness of age. There was once such a man who pleased God, and God accepted him and took him while still living from among sinners. He was snatched away before his mind could be perverted by wickedness, and so on. And then in chapter 5 it says, then the just man will take his stand, full of assurance. Now, the interesting thing is, he's been killed. And here in the Book of Wisdom, they said, even if he has been killed, even if he has been martyred, there will come a day when he will take his stand, full of assurance, to confront those who oppressed him and made light of his suffering. At the sight of him there will be terror and confusion, and they will be astounded at his unforeseen deliverance, remorseful and grieving and so on, that they misunderstood that oppression could triumph over the power of God. So, just to conclude this section, we find that the idea of resurrection has always been, and the resurrection of all the just, we're talking about the day of the Lord, we're talking about the judgment day, of course. We're talking about what is called eschatology, the last times. But the last times are the day of the triumph of goodness, the proof of the power of God. It is against that background that the early disciples meditated on what they considered the martyrdom of Jesus. It's within that context. Now, just before I finish, the unjust are to be confounded to discover that the fullness of life is to be bestowed upon the just one. Now, some of the Jews, therefore, around about this time, the last century before the Common Era, there were Sadducees and Pharisees, and there were Essenes, and there were Zealots, and so on. Remember, the Romans had occupied the Holy Land. And the Pharisees were the group of Jews who were thoroughly convinced and elaborated most clearly the theology of resurrection, the day of the Lord, in which all the martyrs would be justified, those who put their absolute trust in the Lord. So at the end of the as we draw near to the Common Era, therefore, we find resurrection always associated with eschatology, the day of the Lord. Now, I have only one more section where we will look at some of the New Testament writings. I think I'd better check with my time. About 10 minutes. Very good. I then move to the New Testament. And, of course, we could look all through the Gospels at the idea, how the theological concept of resurrection is developed in the Gospels. I'll be looking just at one of the Gospels, Luke. I will be looking at the Pauline letters, because the Pauline letters were the letters written by Paul, and they were written some 30 or 40 years before the Gospel. You know, the Gospels, the four Gospels, were written between 70 and about 110 of the Common Era. 70 after the destruction of the temple. And because you find references to the destruction of the temple in the Gospel accounts themselves. I would like to go, therefore, to literature that was written before the Gospels were written, and that is the Pauline material. And the Pauline letters written by Paul to various small disciple groups, one of the earliest, in fact, scholars would suggest that perhaps the earliest of the letters was written to the people of Thessalonica. And he wrote 2 letters to the people of Thessalonica. In the first letter to the Thessalonians, he starts off, it's a letter from Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy to the church of the Thessalonians, and so on. Grace be to you and peace, and so on. Now, he talks about all kinds of things that are concerning them. And then he says, in chapter 4, verses 13 to 18, he says, "We wish you not to remain in ignorance, friends, about those who sleep in death." Because the Thessalonians were saying, well, the day of the Lord is coming, but some of our friends have died already. What's happening here? "We wish you not to remain in ignorance, friends, about those who sleep in death. You should not grieve like the rest of humankind who have no hope." And this is what Paul says. "We believe that Jesus died and rose again. So too will God bring those who died as followers of Christ, Christians, to be with Jesus. We tell you this as a word from the Lord. All of us who are still alive when the Lord comes will have no advantage over those who have died," and so on. In this first letter of Paul to the Thessalonians, the early Christian groups still have the sense that any day now, the day of the Lord is about to come. The end of the world was any day. And they said, and this is very important to understand the resurrection, because the resurrection of Jesus is in the early Christian communities, is absolutely one with the idea of the great day of the Lord. And they see the resurrection of Jesus as part of the general resurrection. It's very clear from Paul's letter, if you read the first letter of the Thessalonians. I want to read another letter, the letter to the Colossians. Now, with this letter, scholars dispute that Paul himself wrote it. It is in the mind of Paul, but it's a later letter. So I read one from the beginning, a very, very early one, and one from the end. And here you can see how the thinking is being crystallized. In the letter to the Colossians, chapter 1, verse 18, and this is the first time that they will say this. He is the head of the body, the church. That's typical of Paul, to call the group of people who share a life together the body. He is the head of the body, the church. He is its origin, the first to return from the dead, to become in all things supreme. In other translations, he is the firstborn of the dead. So I would like to say that as a Christian theologian, we do not look at the resurrection of Jesus as an isolated something that happened. It is totally in relationship to the revelation of the power and justice and goodness of God, that God was faithful to the one who put in all his trust in him. Remember, in the last moments of Jesus in the Gospels, they speak about his prayer, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, and so on. The tremendous sense of trust, which is typical of the idea of the resurrection. The last thing I would like to have a look at is Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24. It is the end of the Gospel. And in this Gospel, in this account, there are a couple of friends are walking outside Jerusalem and going up the Mount of Olives and to a little place called Emmaus. And after they meet someone on the way whom they don't recognize. They meet Jesus, and he breaks bread with them and then is gone. So it's obviously not a resuscitation. It's an encounter. It's always an encounter in faith. No one meets him but those who encounter him in faith. That's a very important point when we come to resurrection. That's why it's not a question of debating resurrection. It's an encounter in faith. That's my faith. And he said to them in this conversation, "This is what I meant by saying when I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms was bound to be fulfilled." Then he opened their mind to understand the Scriptures. So you see that the Scriptures foretell the sufferings of the Messiah and his rising from the dead on the third day, and declares in his name repentance, bringing the forgiveness of sins to be proclaimed to the nations, beginning in Jerusalem. But what I want you to notice there is that the theological understanding of resurrection still stays with the idea of the martyr suffering in faith and putting all their trust in the goodness of God. So it is quite consistent all through. My last point is, when I was a student, I was asked to make a number of, and this is a first little book as a student, so I encourage you to go for broke. And I was translating from Greek and Latin and Syriac, which is one of the ancient cousins of Arabic, which was a wonderful experience. And in this letter written by a group of martyrs, those who survived, the rest were martyrs, in the French city of Lyon in 177 of Common Era, even as they send a letter to Asia Minor about the sufferings of their fellow community, they speak about the resurrection, and they quote again the idea from the Book of Wisdom, saying those who trusted in God were laughed at by their oppressors, but that they were truly to live, and they were to share the resurrection. It is too large a topic for a half an hour, and what I have chosen to do is to speak about the theological understanding of the resurrection, that resurrection and the last day, the day of the Lord, are two concepts that come absolutely together, and that it is all concentrated upon the power and fidelity of God, which will be revealed as they say, in the day of the Lord. So I thank you very much.
I begin by praising my Creator and yours. Let me do that first in Arabic, and then we'll proceed with our discussion. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulil Kareem. Men, women, the question before us is, was Jesus resurrected? In other words, did he come back to life from the dead? Muslims believe that Jesus never died, that there was a plot to kill Jesus, but God foiled the plan of the non-believers and rescued Jesus, raising him up to himself, and instead had someone else made to look like Jesus. Muslims believe that the non-believers, seeing this other figure to be Jesus, took him, crucified him, and killed him on the cross. Now, the Gospels report that the victim of crucifixion was taken down dead from the cross, was put in a tomb, and that a few days later, when some of the disciples of Jesus, first his female disciples, and then some of his other disciples, came to see the tomb, and they found it empty. Jesus was not there. It eventually dawned upon them that Jesus had come back to life. Some of the Gospels report that some angels spoke to the disciples of Jesus at the scene and told them that Jesus had come back to life and that he will soon appear to his disciples. The Gospels go on to report that indeed there were such sightings. The disciples of Jesus saw him on more than one occasion. And so then we have two divergent views. We have the views of Muslims that Jesus was neither killed nor crucified. And we have the views of Christians that Jesus was killed, was crucified, and that he was raised back to life. Now, both Muslims and Christians believe that Jesus was raised to heaven. Christians believe that after Jesus was raised back to life from the dead, eventually God raised him up to heaven, where he remains alive, and from which place he will descend to earth one more time before the judgment. Muslims also believe that Jesus will come back to earth before the judgment. So we see here among these two faiths, or between these two faiths, an intersection of ideas and a divergence of views. Our ideas intersect on the point of Jesus' ascension and his eventual return, but we diverge over the question of his death and resurrection. Now, to keep our talk in focus, we should realize that the topic then is not so much what is the Muslim view concerning this whole question, nor is it really about the Christian view concerning this question. The topic is very specific. Was Jesus resurrected? So we have to approach the topic by presenting both positive and negative evidence for the question. Their answer could be either yes or no or undecided. Was Jesus resurrected? Perhaps yes, perhaps no, or perhaps there is not sufficient information for us to make up our minds. So we have to come up with one of these three answers. And the answer, I think, should be based on the evidence that is available. Now let's see, what is the positive evidence that could be offered in favor of the resurrection of Jesus? There are a number of different areas of evidence that can be considered, but it seems that there are three primary areas that needs our investigative minds to work on tonight. One we've already noted that according to the Gospels, the tomb of Jesus was empty. And this demands an explanation. The explanation commonly given is that the tomb was empty because Jesus was raised back to life. So we have here a bit of circumstantial evidence that Jesus came back to life. His tomb was empty. I've noted already as well that according to the Gospels, Jesus was seen again to be alive by his disciples. So we have here a second body of circumstantial or indirect evidence that Jesus had come back to life. So we have two. The tomb was empty, and Jesus appeared to his disciples. That would seem to indicate that he must have come back from the dead. The third area I'd like to consider is the historical accuracy of the Gospels that report these two phenomena, the empty tomb and the appearances of Jesus to his disciples. If the Gospels are deemed to be historically accurate, then we must take it as fact that the tomb was empty, that Jesus appeared to his disciples, and the best explanation that could be offered for this occurrence would be that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. Well, let's consider these pieces of positive evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Number one, was the tomb of Jesus empty? As we retrace the materials which were written about this, we realize that the earliest materials that we have today are those which are contained within the New Testament of the Christian Bible. Most notably, the four Gospels and other writings in the New Testament. In the New Testament, the earliest writings are the writings of one man by the name of St. Paul, who is believed to be the author of many letters in the New Testament. Some of these letters are assuredly from the pen of St. Paul, and some others are being discussed by the scholars as to whether they might have been the product of some of his students. But be that as it may, some of the writings which are undisputably St. Paul's would then be the earliest writings we have in the New Testament itself, and hence the earliest writings that attest to the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. So what do these writings say? In one of Paul's letters, in his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul argues at length in chapter 15 that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And this proves that resurrection is possible. And that proves, therefore, that everyone in general, all Christians, should believe that resurrection is possible. Notice the direction in which Paul takes the argument. He starts with the premise that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And then he concludes that everyone should believe that resurrection from the dead is possible. Notice that he did not argue the other way around. He did not start by saying that resurrection is possible and therefore Jesus must have been raised from the dead. Instead, Paul started to establish historically that Jesus had been raised in order to be able to conclude that resurrection from the dead is possible. So then what is the historical information that Paul gives? This should be a matter for study. Paul says that Jesus, after he had been dead, appeared again to his disciples. That he appeared first to Peter, and then to the 12 disciples, and then to James, and to 500 believers, more than half of whom are still alive at the time that Paul is writing this. And that lastly, Jesus appeared also to Paul. So Paul then is citing actual historic information here to say that Jesus had been raised from the dead. But notice here that Paul has only given reference to the second piece of positive evidence. Remember, I said that there are three that we need to consider. Number one, the empty tomb. Number two, the appearances of Jesus to his disciples. And number three, the accuracy and reliability of the Gospels. Paul here is dealing with which one of our three questions? The second one. He's dealing with the appearances of Jesus to his disciples. The discussion of the empty tomb is notably absent from Paul's pleading in this particular chapter. And you may wonder why. It would seem that if Paul knew that the tomb of Jesus had been found empty, that Paul may have marshaled this as an additional piece of evidence to prove that Jesus had indeed resurrected from the dead. But he did not make mention of this. This phenomenon has led many scholars to conclude that perhaps at the time Paul was writing, the idea that the tomb of Jesus had been empty was not concurrent. And that the idea that Jesus' tomb was empty might have been a later development written in the Gospels. The Gospels, I should remind you, were written all after St. Paul. There had indeed been many Gospels that were written, but 4 were selected for inclusion in the New Testament of the Christian Bible. There was a Gospel, for example, that was not included in the Christian Bible, a Gospel which Christian scholars generally call by the name Q. Q is the first initial of the German word Quelle, which means unknown. And Christian scholars have named a gospel as the unknown gospel, or the Q gospel, or the source, rather, gospel. Now, this source gospel, this Quelle, Christian scholars now try to reconstruct from materials which are still available, but scholars do not have direct access to that Q or source document. But reconstructing the best that they can, scholars have come to understand something about the contents and thrust of the message of that gospel which they call Q. And Christian scholars tell us that the gospel known as Q was written around the same time that Paul was writing his letters. But the gospel Q says nothing about the passion and resurrection of Jesus. In other words, his suffering and his resurrection from the dead. Christian scholars say then that Q is evidence that there was a time when it was possible to write a Christian gospel without making reference to the suffering and resurrection of Jesus. In other words, there was an early strand of teaching which represented the teachings of Jesus as not being based on Jesus' death and resurrection. Q was not included in the Christian Bible, although quotations from Q are said to be in the Gospels of Matthew and in Luke. Now I want to move on to show that other Gospels were constructed, were written, and 4 of them were included in the New Testament. And if we look at the 4 Gospels that are there in the New Testament to again investigate the positive evidence, we can see that over time the story about the empty tomb and the appearances of Jesus to his disciples would take on new dimensions as we go from one gospel to another. In other words, as the story was told and retold over time, the story increased in favor of the later Christian orthodoxy. Let me explain how. We've already seen that in the earliest writings that we do have in the New Testament, in St. Paul's writings, we do not have any mention that the tomb of Jesus was empty. Of the four Gospels, the earliest was the Gospel according to Mark. And here we do have reference to the fact that the tomb of Jesus was found empty. But the Gospel of Mark does not give us any reference to an actual appearance of Jesus to his disciples. To put that more carefully, the Gospel of Mark speaks about the possibility that Jesus will appear to his disciples, but does not give us an account that Jesus actually did appear to his disciples. But the later Gospels do. Although two later Gospels, Matthew and Luke, are based upon Mark, and scholars tell us that when these writers were writing their two Gospels, they had before them a copy of the Gospel of Mark. So they had the freedom either to record exactly what Mark wrote or to add what they knew from other sources. And these later Gospel writers then included stories about Jesus appearing to his disciples. So we can see that the story takes on new dimensions as we go over time. But what is important to notice about the stories is that these Gospels that report on the appearance of Jesus to his disciples leave a few puzzles. One of the most notable puzzles is, why is it that whenever Jesus appears to his disciples, invariably the disciples do not recognize him from his facial features? I think this is a question that needs to be addressed. Now let's look at the Gospels one after another. Matthew's Gospel tells us that Jesus appeared to his disciples on a mountain in Galilee. And when they saw him, they worshipped him. But they doubted, according to Matthew chapter 28. Now that's a puzzling statement. If they worshipped him, obviously they knew who he was. But then if they worshipped him, why did they doubt? This question has led many of the translators to render the statement that they worshipped him, but some doubted, as if to give the impression that there might have been some of the disciples that doubted, but not all of them. Or some commentators have even argued that the some who doubted are not the disciples themselves, but some others doubted. Whereas the Greek text actually said they doubted. Now, if we are asking for some bit of historical evidence that Jesus really did rise from the dead, and we are considering our second point, our second bit of positive evidence, then many academic minds would demand that there should be a clear reference to someone bearing testimony saying, yes, I did see Jesus, and I was sure that this was Jesus. If that is what an academic mind looks for, then it will not be found in the Gospel according to Matthew, in this reference that we've just cited. Now, if we move on to the Gospel according to Luke, we see that there too it is narrated that Jesus did appear to his disciples. But here too we are left with the same type of doubt. The first little episode that goes to show this is in Luke chapter 24, where we read that there were two friends of Jesus going along, walking on the country road, going to a little village named Emmaus. Now, as they were walking along, they were talking about the things which had happened in Jerusalem over the last couple of days. They were talking about the fact that Jesus had been crucified and that he had been killed, that obviously he had been put in a tomb. And as they were talking about these things, Jesus walked up alongside them. You have to imagine two men going along on the country road. and somebody comes up and starts to walk along them. Now he joined in their conversation, and he started to explain to them that the things that happened over the last couple of days had to happen that way because so it was written in the scriptures. It had to happen. Now, the narrative tells us that these two friends of Jesus thought that Jesus here was a stranger. In other words, that they didn't recognize him. The gospel says that their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And then, eventually, after going through this long conversation, they reached their destination, the little village of Emmaus. And then they persuaded Jesus to stay with them for a while. And Jesus sat down and broke bread with them. And when Jesus broke the bread, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, but he vanished from their sight. And then they said to each other, "Weren't our hearts burning as he talked to us on the country road?" It would seem from this narrative that the disciples did not initially recognize Jesus from his face. And in fact, some doubt remains as to whether eventually they did recognize him from his face. It would seem as though the manner in which he broke bread is the thing that convinced them that this is really Jesus. And then when he vanished, they started to remind each other that there was a subjective experience that they had, which would confirm that this, in fact, was Jesus. Now, if the actual sighting of Jesus was absolute confirmatory evidence that they had seen Jesus, why would they now refer to this subjective information, the fact that they had experienced a burning in their hearts? There'd be no need for that. But the Gospel of Luke, as it is now, leaves some doubt as to whether this second thing really happened, whether the disciples really saw Jesus. Now, these two disciples, according to the Gospel of Luke, went back to Jerusalem right away in order to share this news, obviously, with the rest of the friends and followers of Jesus. And they went into the room where Jesus' disciples were. And apparently before they could even speak, the disciples said, "Yes, it is true, Jesus has come back to life and he has appeared already to Peter." So they knew that Jesus had come back to life and that he had appeared to Peter. But then as they were saying this, the Gospel of Luke says that Jesus appeared in the very room. And they were afraid, thinking that they had seen a ghost. Now that leaves a further puzzle. Why did they think that they were seeing a ghost if they were sure that Jesus had resurrected from the dead, if Peter had seen him, and if these two other men coming back from the country road can testify that they had seen Jesus? You might expect that they should be eager to meet Jesus, seeing that they were already sure that he had resurrected from the dead. Why would they think that they had seen a ghost if this was really Jesus in appearance? Did Jesus look different? Now, Jesus confirmed that he is really Jesus. He's the same man. And in order to make it clear that he was really here in flesh and blood, he was not a ghost, he told them, "Examine me and see. I am flesh and blood, or I am flesh and bone. A ghost does not have flesh and bone as I have." We should wonder, why is Jesus using this particular line of argument? Why doesn't he say, "Look at me, it is me, Jesus. You knew I was dead, and now you see me again here in person." And then he ate fish and broiled fish and honey in their presence, perhaps to further demonstrate that he was actually flesh and bone. He was not a spirit. We do not have, even in the Gospel of Luke then, a single instant where somebody can come out and say, "Yes, we actually did see Jesus, and we're sure that this was the man that we knew." They recognize him from other features. The Gospel according to John continues along the same lines. We find the same phenomenon repeated in the Gospel of John, that when Jesus is seen, he's not recognized from his facial features. In fact, this problem is even more pronounced in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John says that one of the early followers, a woman by the name of Mary Magdalene, went to the tomb. And when she didn't see Jesus there and found the tomb empty, she concluded that somebody had taken Jesus away. And she doesn't know where they had laid him. But eventually she saw a man in the garden. She turned around and looked at him. When he asked her, "Why are you weeping?" But when she looked at him, she thought he was the gardener. Now, why did she think he was the gardener if his face would betray that he is really Jesus? Did this man have a different face than the face of Jesus? And then eventually he said to her, "Mary." And when he said to her, "Mary," she realized that this was Jesus. Is it the way in which he said Mary that convinced her that this was really Jesus? Why didn't she recognize him from his face in the first place? Now, this gospel goes on to narrate also that Jesus appeared to 10 of his disciples at one time, but one disciple was notably absent, a disciple by the name of Thomas. A week later, Jesus came back to show himself to Thomas because Thomas doubted that Jesus had really come back to life. But when he appeared this second time in order to convince Thomas, Jesus said to him, "Come and put your finger in the place where the nail had pierced me. Come and put your hand in my side where I was pierced, and see that it is I." Why didn't Jesus just simply say, "Look at my face, this is me"? Was Jesus showing here that, look, this is the same crucified body that you saw on the cross? Couldn't he have just simply said, "Well, you knew I was dead, you know I was on the cross, and look, it is me here again"? Why examine the crucifixion wounds in order to be convinced that this was really Jesus? I think our two questions then, out of the three, has to be answered in this way. First, was the tomb of Jesus empty? We have to say that it would appear that the description of the tomb as being empty is a later developing idea. It was not an original historical fact. Our second positive evidence for the resurrection of Jesus was the fact that he appeared to his disciples. But this second piece of evidence has to be taken for the level of certainty it can provide. And we have seen that it leaves a certain degree of doubt that the disciples of Jesus really did see Jesus after he had come back to life. The third area that we should have examined was the historical accuracy of the Gospels. And I think that this itself deserves a separate treatment and a separate talk. But if we cannot establish the first two items, then the third item becomes irrelevant. The third item would have become relevant for this dialogue if we can see that the Gospels are unambiguous and unambivalent about the two items. That first, it is quite clear that the tomb was empty, and second, that Jesus appeared to his disciples and left no doubt that he was really the man. Since these two items are left in doubt, the confirmation of whether or not the Gospels are historically reliable about this also does not need to be addressed in this dialogue. So finally, I think Muslims can be comfortable in believing in the glorious Quran, which reports to us that Jesus was neither killed nor crucified. The Gospels do not offer an alternative which would controvert the Word of God, which Muslims believe to be revealed one final time, and last of all, in the glorious Quran. Thank you.
It was a great joy to hear the close attention to the nearly 300 years of recent biblical scholarship, which has transformed the study of the scriptures. And particularly, I was so delighted to hear the study of what we call source criticism, form criticism, and redaction criticism. Source criticism, which has gone on for 300 years, has been a study of how these strange documents came to be written. The Gospels are a new literary form which have very little to do with biography, very little to do with historians. I am a classical scholar who has studied ancient historical writings, and they don't fit into the genre of historical writings, either from Thucydides, Herodotus, or any of the other great writers. They are faith documents. They make no attempt to be objective. They are thoroughly subjective. They are thoroughly partisan. They are thoroughly from within the faith experience. And it is always the disciples who see Jesus. And it is a very strange, slow way of recognition. Very, very strange and very slow. And that would need hours and hours of discussion. But it was a very fine point which I would very much like to dialogue about, the recognition scenes. And it's always from the disciples. It's not historical. It's not the objectivity of historical. It is the absolute commitment of the disciples. They are the ones who see Jesus. They are the ones who commit themselves. There is so much that I would see that we could fruitfully discuss. You are quite right. It is very interesting about the empty tomb. And I would challenge Christian scholars to study this question very, very well. It is a fascinating question, the empty tomb, that it is not in the writings of Paul, and it is very developed in the later Gospels. Very interesting. But of course I would come to a totally different conclusion. But it is well worth, the clarity of the presentation is enormously inspiring to me, even though I from a scholarly point of view, as well as a faith point of view, would come to very, very different conclusions. Now, there are so many things that I could talk about. I would just like to concentrate on one thing, and that is the death, the reality of the death, because it's true. How can we talk about the question of resurrection unless we talk about the question of death? And we know now better than has been known for 19 centuries. We know the religious climate very, very well, and we know so many of the writings at the time of the first disciples. This is in the centuries, the first, the second, and the third century. The great movement which we called Gnosticism, which really came close to destroying Christianity. Now, the Gnostics were totally opposed to the idea of a birth or a death. What the Gnostics wanted, and here I am far from Islamic theology, and I know that I am far when I talk about Gnostics. The Gnostics wanted to say there was no birth, there was no death. Jesus was a spirit from the outer regions of the universe, the noetic world, they called it. And so there was a great theological debate immediately in the first century. I could quote endless documents about the death, the birth of Jesus. And you will find in all the documentation this tremendous attention to a real death. And, of course, unless there is a real death, you rightly point out, there's no resurrection. So here is a real point of theological debate. As a Christian, why I would insist upon the sense of the death, because of the sharing of our humanity. And I have lived long enough to face death. And I must say that I feel, on one occasion I was facing, they said, well, this is it, you're facing death. It was a great sense of being close to Jesus, in the sense that you know what this is. You know what it is to face death and to go through death. To go through death, because there is our shared humanity in our death. And so I suppose that from a theological point of view, Christians from the very, very first century have talked about this sharing of the whole humanity. And therefore you find in the Christian creed again and again from the first century, died, was buried, and risen. I would like just to talk again about why I had introduced my talk as I did. There is no understanding of the Christian understanding of resurrection unless you understand it in the relationship of the victory, the ultimate victory of God over evil. And I read from the first letter of the Corinthians from St. Paul. Now, if this is what we proclaim, that Christ was raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? Of the dead. Now, they're talking about a general resurrection. If there is no resurrection, then Christ was not raised. And if Christ was not raised, then our gospel is null and void, and so too is your faith. So that, as I said from the beginning, I'm not here to debate a central commitment faith issue in my life. It is not debatable for me. But I am so pleased to have the opportunity of such a learned co-debater and dialoguer who is so well versed in the contemporary studies of the scriptures, and it gives me, and your clarification of the points has been immensely helpful for me. Too many points for me to deal with in a short time, but I would emphasize the Christian emphasis on the reality of the death. It was the Gnostics of mainly the 2nd century and the 3rd century, although they were active in the 1st century too, who were insisting upon the phantom-like idea. This is not what Islamic theology is about. They don't side with the Gnostics, who denied the goodness of the body and said only the spirit was good. We call them radical dualists. How do we know their work? Because their writings were found in 1948 in Egypt at Nag Hammadi. I was in Egypt a few years ago, and the taxi driver was taking us around the bend of the Nile around Luxor, and we saw the sign, Nag Hammadi. And he said, what would you be interested in Nag Hammadi for? It's only got an aluminum factory. Nag Hammadi, where the great Gnostic library was found. So, and that for 4 centuries was the absolute battleground for Christians. And it was in their dialogue with the Gnostics, who denied the death of Jesus, the reality of the death, for a reason very different from what you put forward tonight, but who denied the death because they denied the goodness of the humanity, our humanity, Jesus' humanity, the fullness of Jesus' humanity, the fullness of our humanity. And so they denied the death for a very, very different reason from what I heard tonight.
Where we've come so far is to see that if we need to put our faith in something that would commend itself to academics like yourselves, then it needs to be based on something historical rather than something that some of you may call mythological. If we're looking for something that is historical, then we find two faiths claiming to be historical. Islam claims to be based on history. Christianity claims to be based on history. And so in a dialogue like this one, it is important for us to see what evidence lies either in support of or against some of the doctrines which are held, either by Christians or by Muslims. While we dialogue, it is important to be courteous, to be polite, but also to be clear on the topics that we are discussing. And so I'd like to emphasize that as a Muslim, I have to believe in Jesus, because the Quran commends the belief in Jesus and makes it necessary for a Muslim to believe in Jesus. Therefore, as a Muslim, I believe in Jesus, I love him, and I believe in everything that he taught. I believe that Jesus was born of a virgin, that he was a man who proved himself to be working along with God by the miracles and signs and wonders which God did through him in the midst of people, as many have attested to, that Jesus did many miracles by God's leave and permission. He healed the blind, he cured the leper, and he even raised dead persons back to life. I believe that Jesus was eventually raised up by God, and he remains alive in heaven, from which place God will send him again. So I believe that Jesus' entry into the world was unique. His deeds on the world were awesome. His exit from the world was miraculous, and his return to the world will be spectacular. I think it is also necessary to be clear that we should not assert something about Jesus or about the God who raised Jesus unless that something is really true, and unless it is based on what is supportable either by the scripture or by history or both. Now, whether or not Jesus died and was resurrected is our question tonight. Or, more precisely, our question is, was Jesus resurrected from the dead? The question itself starts with the assumption that Jesus died. And we're asking now, was he resurrected from the dead? Or we can start with a different assumption, that Jesus neither died nor resurrected from the dead. But either way, our answer will be that he did not resurrect from the dead, as far as the evidence that we have considered tonight. For Jesus to have resurrected from the dead, assuming that he did die, we have to establish at least two things. One, that his tomb was found to be empty after his dead body was buried therein. And two, that he appeared again alive to his disciples after they had known him to be dead and buried. Since we were unable to establish these two things, then I think we have established that the idea that Jesus was resurrected from the dead is not based on history. It might be based on theology, but not on history. Otherwise, we should be able to establish that either tonight or some other time in the near future. Now, there does remain, however, a question as to what happened if Jesus was not killed, or if Jesus was not crucified, or if he was not resurrected from the dead, then what exactly did happen? I should point out that if we lack an explanation as to what happened, that does not help to prove the question that we initially started out with. However, I will offer an explanation. The explanation that is given in many commentaries on the Quran is that a substitute was crucified instead of Jesus, that another person was made to look like Jesus, and this one was crucified instead. He looked and sounded like Jesus, and so his enemies thought they really had the man dead. But what they had killed is not Jesus, but someone else. What happened to Jesus? According to these commentaries, Jesus was in a room with his disciples, And when the arrestors came to get him, Jesus, in the meantime, had been taken up by God through a hole in the roof. And someone else was made to look like Jesus, and this someone else was grabbed and crucified instead. Who was the someone else? Some of the commentators said it was Judas Iscariot, the very man who we read about was supposed to be an enemy of Jesus and tried to betray him, to hand him over to his enemies to be killed. Some others have said that it was one of his disciples, the youngest one, who offered himself to be a volunteer, to be crucified instead of Jesus, so that he could achieve the martyrdom and be with Jesus in paradise. Now, we noted in this story that Jesus had been taken up through a hole in the roof. And many may say that this doesn't seem likely given the gospel accounts. The gospels say that Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane at the time of his arrest. Do they not? Or do they? I have with me a copy of an issue of Biblical Archaeology Review, a publication of the Biblical Archaeology Society. In a recent issue, there appeared an article written by one Joan Taylor, a scholar who has done some archaeological study of the situation in the time of Jesus, and more precisely, the circumstances surrounding his arrest and crucifixion. Joan Taylor has established that there is no such thing as the Garden of Gethsemane. There is a garden, and there is a Gethsemane, but not a Garden of Gethsemane. People came up with the expression Garden of Gethsemane by conflating the reports of two different Gospels. One says garden, one says Gethsemane, so people said the Garden of Gethsemane. But she's established that the word Gethsemane actually means an oil press. And there is a cave near to the said garden which actually was being used as an oil press in the time of Jesus. And it is very likely that Jesus and his disciples used to spend their nights in this cave. And this was the place of his arrest. Now, some reconstructions of this cave have to be made because it has changed its form and structure over time. Nowadays, it has been converted to a church, and visitors to Jerusalem can still visit this Gethsemane or this ancient oil press. But what can be established is that early on there used to be two cisterns, two little wells. And the narratives show that Jesus, when he spoke to his disciples and asked for a substitute, at the time his hair was dripping wet. Perhaps this is an indication that Jesus had taken a bath from one of these cisterns. But more pertinent to our question is about the hole in the roof. That hole in the roof of this cave still remains to this day. It would seem then that there is supporting evidence that what the Quran said is actually true. Where did the writers of the commentaries on the Quran get this information about Jesus and how he was arrested? This was the sort of information that was being transmitted and discussed among their Christian contemporaries. And so they noted down these as commentaries to the Quran. In other words, to explain what the Quran is speaking about, the commentators listened to what Christians were narrating about this event, and they said this is what Christians themselves are narrating. This is the story as it is being circulating. However, more than one stories were circulating at the time, and Muslim commentators, not being able to sift through between the varying reports, noted down many of these stories. We can see today that some of these stories are based on some historical fact, especially the fact of the cave of Gethsemane, not the Garden of Gethsemane, which still has the roof and the hole in the roof to this day. Men and women, tonight we were asking, was Jesus resurrected from the dead? We said that for him to be proven to be resurrected from the dead, we have to establish that indeed his tomb was empty, and indeed, unambiguously, it is reported that people saw him after he came back to life. We could not establish any of these 2 points, and therefore it remains to ask other questions as to, for example, what other alternatives there are. If we do not have a good answer to the alternative question, it does not imply that we have a good answer to the original question, and the original question is still this: was Jesus resurrected from the dead?
Specifically in the Gnostic Gospels that the denial and the story of the substitution of Christ is written up with great detail. In fact, there's one of them that talks about the laughing Christ, and I find it particularly offensive. The laughing Christ, is where this the spirit Christ, the phantom Christ, stands in front of the crucifix while everybody else is, weeping and being sad, and he's laughing his head off to think that people are not aware of a substitution. And as I said, they are proved with all sorts of dating, codifications, scientific dating, the 2nd and the 3rd century. And so certainly they were circulated, and certainly they were circulated as Christian documents. They call themselves Christian, and that's why the enormous fight went on for the distinguishing of what we call the canon of Scripture, the 4 Gospels and the rejection of the Gnostic Gospels. And why did they neglect them? Why did they reject them? They rejected them because it was not the faith of the Church, because it was not the death of Jesus, who goes into the deepest moment of human existence, to the point of death, and there still trusts in God. And that is the center of the Christian understanding of the death and resurrection of Christ. The absolute trust that even in death one will find the God of life. And it is within the context of the what we call the resurrection, the general resurrection, that this is always understood. So that I can only say this other thing. We talk about historical. It is true that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam reject a mythological understanding where you have just the forces of nature, just the cycles of nature. No, we say this real life where we walk this one time, where we walk and eat and meet and live this life historically, really, this is the center. We don't want any kind of drifting off into symbols, drifting off into myths. We reject the mythological, and that's why they rejected Gnosticism, because it wanted to reduce everything to symbol, to floating ideas, to the abstract, instead of the concrete reality of life, lived, chosen. And so in this case, that we do share a historical. But as a historian, I know that history, and it comes from the Greek word historia, inquiry, is always a matter of understanding. It is always a matter of interpretation. I think of being present at a family gathering with my brothers and sisters, and we talk about these family gatherings. We were all there. We all remember different things. We are not lying, but we are interpreting according to experience and commitment. So history is also interpretation, and interpretation is, I think, the highest human experience. It's where all our intelligence, memory, life, and all the rest come together in an understanding of who we are, a reflected light, so that there is no scientific proof of the death of Jesus. If it were scientifically proved, we would all have to believe it. Belief is the leap of faith. Belief is where you trust. Belief is where you say, I put my life in my hands. I trust, and that is my life. And that's why I say it is not scientifically proven. If it were scientifically proven, we would have no choice. Faith is always the moment of decision and commitment, whatever our faith is. So that I reject the word historical if we mean scientific proof, because there is no proof, there is no choice. But if it means historical as interpretation, certainly. So,
one, we have to establish that given the assumption that he had died and was buried in a tomb, that one, we have to establish that the tomb was later discovered to be empty. Two, we have to establish that Jesus did appear alive again to his disciples. And three, given the first two, we would have to also establish that the records that tell us these things is actually dependable. We would ask about the reliability and accuracy of the Gospels. Now, we have seen that the idea that the tomb was empty is a later developing idea. In the New Testament, the earliest writings are the writings of St. Paul, and in the writings which are indisputably his, we do not have any reference to the empty tomb of Jesus. Now, when St. Paul was busy pleading for the fact of the resurrection of Jesus, we would expect him, had he known about the empty tomb, to make some reference to that fact. But he made no reference. Scholars have generally concluded that Paul obviously did not know about the story of the empty tomb. So this was a later developing idea. Now, we've seen also that there was the idea of Jesus appearing to his disciples, which St. Paul did attest to. But this idea, although it is written in 3 Gospels out of the 4, we see that we do not have a clear, unambiguous, unambivalent reference that someone can testify that I actually absolutely saw Jesus, and I'm sure that this was the man. You might expect that someone bearing witness that he has seen a person would say that he recognized the person from his facial features, unless for some reason his face had been disfigured. Now, the crucified victim did not have any disfiguring of the face as far as we can tell from the Gospels. And yet, this obviously crucified man who appeared to Jesus' disciples, as is reported in the Gospels, is invariably recognized not from his face, but from the crucifixion wounds which he bore. We've seen that as we trace through the stories from Matthew, going through Luke, and finally with John, that we do not have a single place where the disciples could say unambiguously, yeah, this is the face of Jesus. We've seen that in the Gospel of Matthew, in chapter 28, the disciples saw Jesus and worshipped him, but they doubted. One Bible translation renders this phrase doubted as they were not really sure that it was Jesus. That's the Bible in Living English. We've seen that the Gospel according to Luke tells us about 2 disciples who were walking along, and Jesus walked along with them, spoke to them, and finally broke bread with them, and then only they recognized him. We saw that when Jesus came into the room, his disciples thought that they were seeing a ghost, and he said, "Handle me to see that the ghost does not have flesh and bone as I have." We've seen that according to the Gospel of John, when Jesus appeared to his disciple Mary, this female disciple, she looked at him and thought that she was seeing the gardener. Did Jesus have the face of a different man at this point? But when he said Mary, she recognized him and she said, "My Lord." Or rather, teacher, Rabboni, as one would address a Jewish rabbi. We've seen that as we trace these stories, whereas we would look for an unambiguous testimony that somebody has seen Jesus and recognized him from his face, that testimony is not there. Now, when finally Jesus appeared to Thomas, the doubter, Thomas wanted to make sure that he could put his finger in the nail wound and in the spear wound to verify that this was Jesus. And this is how he finally recognized Jesus. So our question then has to be answered in this way. We have not seen a positive evidence that is convincing that the resurrection of Jesus was actually a historical event. We may believe it on theological grounds, but when we come to an academic discussion such as this one, we want to bring together not only our theologies, but we want to, in some sense, subject our theologies to a mutual historical investigation. Our question then has to be answered that perhaps no, or perhaps undecided. But we do not have sufficient evidence now from a historic point of view to say with certainty that Jesus did resurrect from the dead.
You did not make clear from your talk whether resurrection happened or not. If the day of God happened, how do you explain the fact that the world now is full of injustices and corruption?
Very true. No, the day of the Lord has not come. It is still, we still wait. We wait in the time for the coming of the great day of the Lord, whatever that is. And I'm not talking science here. I'm not talking about blowing up of worlds or anything else. I believe that if anything happens to our planet, on the whole, we do it. But the day of the Lord is about the revelation of evil for what it is. It is about the revelation of the justice of God for what it is. And that's part of the mystery of God. So I'm not going to talk about in scientific terms or historical terms about the day of the Lord. This is part of the mystery of God. But that God is good and opposes injustice, that is central in my understanding, in my belief system, and I'm sure that is something that we do indeed share. And I have said that the resurrection for a Christian, the resurrection of Jesus has occurred, but it has occurred in the expectation of the day of the Lord, which remains in the future. So that I say, one, the resurrection of Jesus, but it is not detached from the understanding of the revelation of the day of the Lord. The resurrection of Jesus cannot be separated from the great general resurrection, which is the day of the Lord. So, in Christian understanding, in my understanding, in my faith, in my commitment, Jesus is risen. That's what I say. That's what I believe. That's what my faith is about. But it points to and is a hope sign for the great day of the Lord.
Thanks. Open question. How do Christians reconcile the differences in the reporting of all four Gospels, and how they each differ in the discovery of Jesus in the tomb?
Yes, there are four Gospels, and they choose different topics sometimes. Sometimes they record a story. For example, Matthew has Jesus sitting on a mountain, giving the great sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. Luke recalls much of the same story, and he puts it on a plain. Their geographic detail is often very blurred. Is this surprising? They are writing their Gospels 70, 80, 90 years. Well, no. They are writing their Gospels 50, 60 years after the Galilean experience of Jesus, when this land is no longer open to them. The Gospels were not written in Palestine. They were written far away. It was after the destruction, after the dispersal of the peoples. So the geographic details, Luke on his mountain, Luke on his plains, and Matthew on his mountains, they become very much, Matthew speaks in terms, he identifies or he puts the figure of Moses and Jesus often very much parallel. And when he likes mountains for great sermons, it is obviously to remind us of another law that came on a mountain, the new law and the old law, so that where geographic details are not together in the Gospels, but when you think of when they're written, it's most understandable, 60, 70 years after.
Sure.
I'd like to answer the part of the question that deals with the empty tomb, which has occupied much of our discussion tonight. The question, as you recall, was, how do Christian scholars reconcile the differences among the four Gospels in reference to the discovery of the empty tomb? Now, there have been varying responses from Christian scholars concerning this. Some scholars have said that the differences among the four Gospels regarding the empty tomb is no different in the matter of divergence of one story from another than the divergence of the stories we notice in reference to other episodes. Let me try to restate that. It's quite a mouthful. The Christian scholars say that if you look in the Gospels, you notice the kind of differences that Dr. Bright has just spoken about. One Gospel writer has Jesus delivering a sermon on a mount, but another Gospel writer has the same sermon split up into portions delivered by Jesus in many other occasions over time. So whereas in one Gospel we speak about a sermon on a mount, in another Gospel we speak about the same sermon being on a plain, for example. But when it comes to the stories about the empty tomb, some Christian scholars say we notice the same kind of difference here, so that the empty tomb should be taken, or the narratives about the empty tomb should be treated in the same manner that we treat the other stories. However, some other scholars have said that the divergence in the stories about the empty tomb are actually quite large, and there are a number of points on which the four Gospels differ in their narratives. If you ask a few questions, for example, and you go to the four Gospels to get the answers to these questions, you're surprised at the amount of divergence that you notice. For example, if you ask, how was Jesus buried? Was he buried according to the Jewish rite with all of the spices wrapped on his body, or was he not? According to three Gospels, he was not. According to the fourth Gospel, he was. If you ask then what was done in response to that, perhaps some of the disciples tried to anoint Jesus with the spices. Did they or did they not? According to some of the Gospels, yes. According to another Gospel, nothing is stated, and it doesn't seem likely. And the fourth Gospel already says that the spices were applied. If you ask, when did the women buy the spices in order to anoint Jesus' body with the spices, you find again different answers. One Gospel says that they already prepared the spices the very night of the crucifixion. Another Gospel says that after the Sabbath was over, which would be a day and a half later, they prepared the spices to anoint Jesus' body. And so you have the discrepancies one after another. If you ask at what time of day the early disciples came to see the tomb, one Gospel says before dawn, and another one says after sunrise. And you know that these are two very different times. And if you keep going, you find the same kind of discrepancy is there. So some of the scholars, in fact many, have said that the discrepancies are too many to be reconciled, and it makes the story very difficult to put one's complete trust in. So we notice that there is a kind of divergence here which is similar to divergence in reporting other stories, as Dr. Bright has pointed out, but some scholars have said that the divergence in the narrative concerning the empty tomb are too many to give us a kind of certainty or confidence about the empty tomb. And couple that with the fact that the reference to the empty tomb was not found in Paul's writings, scholars are comfortable now in declaring that the empty tomb narratives are a later development.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
I'm old enough to have more trust in discrepancies. I am more suspicious of too neat a tradition.
I have read in the Bible that the son will not be accused of the father's sins. Doesn't this statement differ with the concept of the original sin? If one is not born with his father's sin, wouldn't he be born without sin?
The concept of original sin. Here we are in the 4th century, and my specialization is Augustine, who is theologizing about how we are all wounded deeply, deeply by sin. And as a theologian, he is the one in the 4th century and the early 5th century who speaks about the theological category of original sin. And since I'm a great admirer of Augustine, I can say comfortably it's not one of my favorite theological concepts. I would rather talk about original grace. But we would be far, far from the question that has come if I were to talk about the origins of the theological doctrine of original sin in 4th century North Africa and 5th century North Africa. I would rather go to the heart of the question: do we inherit sin? Or is sin that which belongs to our free choice? I would say that we have only to look at the environment, how wounded we are in a sinful environment, how vulnerable we are in a sinful environment, but we never lose our capacity under the grace of God to make choices for good and to reject evil. May I look at it again? Because I got lost in... is believed to be a... I don't think so. I'm sorry. Concept, you rightly said the concept of original sin. It's the theological doctrine of the 5th century church, Augustine in particular, in relation to his fight with a man called Pelagius, who said that we always have the innate capacity to, from nature and not from God's help, to always choose the good. And Augustine was opposing Pelagius. So we have to understand the original sin in relation to that theological fight that was going on in the 4th and 5th century.
Who wrote the Book of Wisdom? Was it revealed or only made up by man, as were the Gospels?
Oh, that's a terrible question. Who wrote the Book of Wisdom? As I have said, it was written in Alexandria, and it was never written in Hebrew. It was written in Greek, and therefore is not accepted into the Hebrew Bible, which was formed as a kind of canon around about the 4th and 5th century of the Common Era. But it was included in the Jewish books and accepted as revelation by the Jews of the diaspora. And it made its way into a book which we call the Septuagint. And it was the Septuagint which was the translation from Hebrew into Greek in Alexandria in about the 3rd century before the Common Era, that the Book of Wisdom was added to, so that the Christian church, in receiving, they read the Greek Old Testament, they read the Greek scriptures. They did, for the most part, they didn't read the Hebrew scriptures, and they certainly accepted the Book of Wisdom as revelatory, meaning that which God speaks through, even though it is written by human hands, but that which God speaks through, that which is a revelation of the will and the presence of God through a holy book, that which makes scriptures.
If Jesus said that he would give us the miracle of Jonah to prove he is the Messiah, but in the story of Jonah, Jonah never dies, how can you say Jesus died and was resurrected when the miracle of Jonah was that he survived and everyone thought he was dead?
Yes. Could I listen to it again? If Jesus said he would give us the miracle of Jonah to prove he is the Messiah, indeed. I think that I have, from the very beginning of tonight, have moved away from any sense that the resurrection was to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. I have said that the resurrection is the proof of the fidelity of God to Jesus. Resurrection is always about the fidelity of God. It's not a crass proof of anything.
I'd like to add, if I may, that the resurrection was seen early on as the only way to reconcile the death of Jesus with his messiahship. The Christians in the time of Jesus, or rather, that's anachronistic to say what I want to say. I should say the Jews in the time of Jesus, reading their Old Testament, did not have an expectation of a Messiah who was to die. They understood that the Messiah would be victorious over his enemies, and he would establish the kingdom of God on earth. And so, once it was proclaimed that Jesus had died, something had to be made of the obvious tension between his messiahship and his death. Once it can be proclaimed that Jesus was raised from the dead, it is reported in the New Testament that early Christians proudly declared that Jesus, by being raised from the dead, was proven by God to be the Messiah. And I think that's a fine point that needs to be noted in response to that question. Now, furthermore, what about the sign of Jonah? This remains a bit of a puzzle, because now many of the later preachings were read back into the gospel narratives as though Jesus had said these things. So whereas it was proclaimed now that Jesus is alive, it was read back that Jesus predicted his own death and resurrection. And one of the things that's reported about him is that he said that he will give no sign but the sign of Jonah. In fact, in one place in Matthew's Gospel, in chapter 12, verse 40, it says that as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now, this statement itself has proven to be a statement which many scholars have recognized to be a later gloss. For example, in the Abingdon Bible commentary, it is noted in reference to this verse that it seems to be a later scribal error, that somebody might have inserted this by error, but it could not have been something that Jesus himself might have said while he was still walking the earth.
It is certainly true that one of the great areas of biblical scholarship is what are the actual words of Jesus and what are the prayerful meditations on Scripture in understanding Jesus. There's no doubt that there are areas of the Scriptures that the Gospel writers are bringing deliberate parallels between the older Scriptures, the Jewish Scriptures, and the experience of Jesus. They do it quite systematically. It is one of the very, very interesting parts of the Christian Scriptures to explore. And there is another point here too about the Gnostics in saying that they refused the death of Jesus. You see, they refused a death, and therefore you have this great concentration upon the death and the suffering of the Messiah. And in fact, this was unexpected. It's true, what was expected was a glorious Messiah, and instead you have the paradox and the scandal of a suffering Messiah. And therefore you have the reading back of the Old Testament, the reading into the book, in reading the prophet Isaiah, especially what we call the servant songs, where it begins to talk, where there can be features of a suffering Messiah. So it's perfectly true that for the earliest disciples, the greatest scandal was the sense of a non-victorious Messiah, a suffering Messiah, a rejected Messiah, let alone a murdered Messiah or a dead Messiah. I shouldn't have used that word murdered. Dead Messiah, killed, executed, whatever. So that's perfectly true. Another point about the Gnostics was that the Gnostics absolutely rejected for the most part, they rejected the Hebrew Scriptures, and therefore the Christian scholars continually kept the Jewish Scriptures and the new Christian Scriptures together in their meditations on the meaning of Jesus. And it's absolutely true. They say Moses and Jesus, they talk about David and Jesus, they talk about Jonah and Jesus. Perfectly true.
We'll try to finish in about 10 minutes maximum that we'll give it. So please bear with us a little bit. And I know some of you is trying to get home soon. Is it okay?
That's true.
Okay. The question in Islam, the faith is that Jesus was raised by God. It is a matter of faith. While Christianity believe that Jesus was resurrected, and it is a matter of faith too. There was a man who was killed, for sure. Both agree on that. Who could have told people at that time that Jesus was raised? So I'll start with you.
Who could have told people that Jesus was raised? It's the origins of the Christian movement is the experience of people called the eyewitnesses. The eyewitnesses. And here I'm not talking about biological, scientific. We're talking about the eye of commitment and faith and recognition that Jesus was alive. He was alive. And they have all sorts of conflicting ideas of what it is to be alive to them, but they're not talking about a ghost, they're not talking about a memory, they're talking about a life-giving presence. And beyond that,
in discussing these questions, we have to distinguish between what is historically possible to be established and what is to be left on faith alone. Let us say, for example, one looks at Jesus' body, obviously appearing dead, and then suddenly the body disintegrates and Jesus appears alive, hovering in midair, just above his once dead body. Now, you may conclude that the dead body resurrected and is now hovering in midair. But someone else may conclude that for some unknown physical reason, all of the atoms in Jesus' body suddenly reconstituted their form and are now hovering in midair. You may conclude that God has raised Jesus, but somebody else may conclude something different. So what is to be left on faith here is that God is acting behind what you observe. That much has to be put on faith, because you cannot put God in a test tube. But if it is claimed that this did happen on a certain occasion, then it is a historical claim. And we should use whatever historical tools are available to find out whether or not it can be established that somebody did in fact see the once dead body of Jesus now disintegrated and hovering in midair. See, that much should be established in history, and then the rest can be left to theology. Whether or not God is behind this, or Satan is behind this, or some other unknown force is behind this, or some known physical force is behind this, that is the matter that should be left to faith. But the actual occurrence should be based on history. Now, when Christians and Muslims claim that Jesus was raised, Christians make that claim based on faith in the gospel narratives and in the Acts of the Apostles and other writings in the New Testament. Muslims make that claim based on the narrative which they believe to be the Word of God, revealed to them in the glorious Quran. Both are making a statement of faith. Both are saying we believe this book to be the Word of God and what it narrates to be true. And hence it says that Jesus was raised, and I believe then that Jesus was raised. We should bear in mind, however, that what it relates as having a historical basis should be possible to be tested against history. And we should not believe things which are obviously contrary to known facts. If it is known that something actually happened one way, and the book tells you it happened another way, you have a choice. Either you're going to believe the history, or you're going to believe the book. If you're going to believe the history, it's because you have faith in historical principles. If you believe the book, it is because you believe the book to be the Word of God. So you might want to address it from a different perspective. You might want to say, what evidence is there that any of these books is really from God? So Christians have tested their Gospels, and they have said that the Bible is a combination.
Paul, the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15. But you may ask, how are the dead raised? In what kind of body? Now I quote Paul. What a stupid question. The seed you sow does not come to life unless it has first died. And what you sow is not the body that shall be, but a bare grain of wheat, perhaps of something else. And God gives it the body of his choice, each seed its particular body. All flesh is not the same. There is human flesh, flesh of beasts, of birds, of fishes, all different. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, and the splendor of the heavenly bodies is one thing, and the splendor of the earthly another. The sun has a splendor of its own, the moon has a splendor, and so on. And so it is with the resurrection of the dead. Don't ask me about the DNA of Jesus before or after the resurrection, and particularly after the resurrection. It is, as I have said, when we talk about resurrection, we are talking about the final, the triumph of God. And how the triumph of God expresses itself in our bodies, I do not know. But what the early Christians said was that they encountered Jesus. They didn't expect to. And there were slow recognitions, and there were all sorts of just little things, and they said, they were not expecting it. And what they talked about in very ambiguous terms about the recognition of that life-giving presence among them is what we call, is what Christians call the raising of Jesus, the pointing to the fullness of the time of the day of the Lord. And I cannot talk about what kind of a body it was, whether it was hovering or what it was doing. It was a life-giving, holy, alive presence. And as we know, the Jews could not imagine a whole presence just as a spirit. They wanted it to be the whole presence, body and soul. But what kind of body? I leave that to God.
Again, we extend it to about 4 more minutes, and that's it. But I know there is so many questions, and that really proves that the audience were completely interacting with the speakers, and that's very good. What we will do, inshallah, we will get all these questions answered by both speakers in their time, and then we will post them for all of you so that you will be able to read the answers later on. But tonight we will continue to use the time that we have in our hand. This question says, how come St. Paul said in Act 26:23 that Moses said that the Christ would be the first to rise from the dead? Moses never said about Christ's resurrection. So he's... Okay.
It's the understanding of what they mean by Moses. They mean that they assumed that Moses wrote the major part of the Hebrew Scriptures. They said Moses. When you read the Hebrew Scriptures, they said, especially the first 5 books. And so if a Christian read anything that pointed to resurrection, they would say, and Moses said.
The second question, why didn't Jesus ask his disciples to believe in his resurrection for their salvation? I'll get to this one.
I think he did. Why didn't he?
Why he didn't ask his disciples to believe in
his resurrection for their salvation? I think he did.
Right.
I'm not aware of where he has done this, as far as we can tell from the Gospels in the narratives. I'm not aware of where Jesus has actually asked people to believe in this in what we can retrace as his historical words. And so I think the question remains, but if Dr. Bright will point out where Jesus has said this in any of his sayings that we can establish with historic reliability, then I think this is something that we should be prepared to learn.
Of course, it is. Of course, the great question, as I said, of New Testament study is to say, what were the very words of Jesus? What were the later memories in relation to reading the Old Testament and so on? But this is first century writing. Mary and Martha have just lost their brother Lazarus. And this is the Gospel of John, chapter 11. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been 4 days in the tomb. Here we're talking about a resuscitation. No resurrection, resuscitation. Bethany was just under 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many of the Jews had come to the city to visit Martha and Mary and condole with them and their brother. As soon as Martha heard that Jesus was on his way, she went to meet him and left Mary sitting at home. And Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that God will grant you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said, "Your brother will rise again." He was speaking of the general Pharisaic understanding that there will be the day of the Lord, the general resurrection. "I know he will rise again," said Martha, "at the resurrection on the last day." And Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever has faith in me shall live even though he dies, and no one who lives and has faith in me shall ever die. Do you believe this?" "I do, Lord," she said. "I believe," and she goes on, and of course it's the great faith of the Messiah. But the question is, when said?
The key statement in that whole passage is Jesus saying, "I am the resurrection and the life." This comes out of John's Gospel, and my humble pursuit as a student of the New Testament would definitely need some corrective from Dr. Bright, who is a scholar of perhaps the same or better caliber than as those from whom I've been learning. But what I've learned from these Christian scholars is that the "I am" sayings in the Gospel of John are notoriously of a later time than the actual historic time when Jesus walked Palestine. The Gospel of John, it should be noted, is the last of the four Gospels to be written, and it is only in the Gospel of John that we find these famous "I am" sayings, where Jesus says, "I am this and I am that. I am the door of the sheep. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am," and so on and so forth. And again, it is in John's Gospel that he says, "I am the resurrection and the life." So if we ask for what is historically traceable back to Jesus, this is not one of the statements.
Yes, I have prefaced that by the notorious difficulty of knowing, what were the words of Jesus and what were the belief of the early church. But here we're looking first century.
Last question. I see Omar is waiting for the whole thing to close, but the question to Dr. Bright, he said, "Dr. Bright, you did not respond to the question of the apostles not recognizing Jesus. If Jesus really was Jesus, how come nobody recognized his face? If they, his apostles, could not recognize him when he was resurrected, isn't it also possible that someone else died on the cross in his place?"
I think they have something else in mind. I think they say that faith is a life journey and that faith gradually dawns.
That's it. By this we conclude for tonight, and I thank all of you for your patience and your courtesy that you have demonstrated. And I thank both guest speakers who were very kind and really did cooperate together to give us this very nice dialogue. Thank you very much indeed.